Good morning, everyone. And Matt, thank you for kicking things off today and your opening remarks. You did a good job actually teeing up our first panel today. I mean, made my job a little bit easier. So we're going to spend the next hour talking about some of the issues that were surfaced yesterday and some new ones, and really kind of all in the spirit and theme of thinking about, as Matt said, what are we going to be doing over the next 3 to 5 years? Now that we have, and as we've discussed, and as you saw, I think, in numerous company presentations yesterday, gotten to the point where we are really demonstrating clinical success and validating a lot of the work that we're doing in the clinic and then ultimately taking these products to patients. But we're still very much at the beginning of this journey, and I think we all appreciate that. We have a long way to go, but there's incredible excitement in this space for where we are, how far we've come. But we now recognize that as we're really moving into a period of intense activity around commercialization, around continuing to build the clinical pipeline and address diseases we haven't really been talking about as much yet. I mean, beyond the, a number of the rare diseases and cancers. Some other, there's a
GPS.
Yeah, GPS. I'll turn that down. So anyway, so obviously it's much discussed, and we purposely left the theme of this panel a little bit open-ended so we could explore some of these topics. So we have an excellent panel today, and what I'm going to do first is introduce each of them and ask them to actually introduce themselves in a little bit more detail and talk a little bit about kind of what they see from their vantage point as kind of key developments, challenges in the next 3 to 5 years, but not just what the problem is. It's what we're doing to overcome them. And so I think we'll just go left to right. So Amy, you're in the seat of honor, closest
Thank
to the
you.
podium. If you would like to begin. Amy is the co-founder and CEO of Vineti.
Great. It's great to be here. Thanks so much to ARM for organizing yet another wonderful conference. Great to be here with so many friends in the industry. My name is Amy DuRoss. I'm the CEO and a co-founder of Vineti. So Vineti is an orchestration software platform that is purpose-built for cell and gene therapy, personalized therapies, really to help enable industrialize this field, and make it possible to realize the patient access promise of these remarkable therapies. My background is really, first and foremost, as a patient advocate. I got started very early in that career as a child, and I am very proud to be a patient advocate today, and just excited to be here with all of you. Thanks.
Great. Sven, before I hand it over to you, I forgot. Laura asked me just to remind everybody in this room, we're doing things a little bit differently today. We actually have 2 concurrent sessions going on. There are company presentations going on in the room next to us. So if you're wondering when those are going to start, or if you're interested in attending those, I don't want the whole room to get up and leave. We'd like those who are obviously here for the session to stay, but I just want to make sure people were aware of that. So Sven, if you could introduce yourself next. So Sven Kili with Sven Kili Consulting.
Good morning, Morrie, and good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak. Briefly about myself, I am fortunate enough to have been in this industry for a few years, and also fortunate enough to have led the development, approval, and launch of a cell therapy in terms of MACI, as well as a gene therapy in terms of Stromvelis, and also led the clinical development and preclinical programs for the 8 GSK assets that were sold to Orchard last year. Subsequent to that, I've started working for a small startup company, snappily known as Spanky Lee Consulting. And essentially what we do as a company is I support a variety of small companies. And so I've been getting involved in helping small companies start up, think about how do they take this incredibly cool technology that the scientists invent in the lab, and how do we think about taking that and translating that into humans, and how do we think about helping patients with that technology And then also the more standard stuff about doing clinical development programs and thinking about clinical trials. And so Morrie asked also just to talk about some of the challenges and the new things that we're seeing. And one of the things that I'm seeing that I find really interesting is that we've kind of covered off the big basic things. We've done many of the monogenic diseases, or we're doing them at the moment. And so now we're starting to think about the technologies that are improvements on what we have already, or slightly different, or changes. And we're starting to blur the edges of cell and gene therapy. And we're starting to look at things just outside when we wake up first thing in the morning, think, what is a cell therapy or what is a gene therapy? And we're thinking about the stuff on the edges. And that's really exciting. But the challenges that we're starting to have with that is the technology is exciting, but how do we use it? And who do we use it on? And so there's a lot of work that we're doing that we're thinking about how do we leverage these technologies and thinking about patients, think about multigenic disorders and environmentally caused disorders, and how do we think about that? So perhaps we'll talk about that a bit more as we go on.
Excellent. So next we have John Tchelingerian, who's the CEO of Promethera Biosciences. So John, if you could introduce yourself and maybe just talk a little bit about your kind of unique approach to partnering and financing your company.
Thanks, Morrie. Good morning, everyone. My name is John Tchelingerian. It's a difficult name, Armenian origin. I'm French. My mother was American, so almost global. And I started my career as a Ph.D. in neurosciences, entrepreneur. In 1995, I was one of the pioneers in the field of cell and gene therapy at that time for brain disorders, retinal disorders. The company I co-founded, Neurotech Pharmaceuticals, is currently based in the US. And I'm the CEO of Promethera since 2015. Our company is a global innovator in liver diseases, mainly using advanced therapies, cell therapies. We're adding also antibody capabilities just to basically have combined approach on the advanced NASH segment that we call the F4 decompensated NASH. And the company is really thriving currently on the capital raising, access to capital in Asia. And I think that's an important message today that I would like to convene. We as Europeans, we're just, focusing on European money, sometimes US. US is very difficult. As you know, US investors are highly sophisticated. In our field of liver diseases using mesenchymal stem cells, that was really a roadblock for us. So when I joined the company and teamed up with Etienne Sokal here in the room, who's going to present at 11:15, we said, guys, let's go east. It's very simple. We're getting, hitting the wall with US investors. Let's go east. And we went to Japan. We had Mitsui as a shareholder, and we started to really pile up the cash since 2016. We overall raised $100 million or euros, and we're going to announce a massive fundraising in a few weeks, again from Asia, Japan, Korea, and a bit from China. So I think that's what I'm going to convey today to the audience, and I'm very happy to give tips or discuss about tactics or contacts, and please, after the panel, I'm happy to entertain discussions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, John. So next up is Chris Vann, slightly less challenging than Tchelingerian.
There you go.
Let's switch.
So Chris, we worked on that during our prep session. So Chris is the Chief Operating Officer of Autolus Therapeutics. So Chris, if you could introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about Autolus.
So I'm Chris Vann. I'm the Chief Operating Officer, Commercial Leader for Autolus. I'm reliably informed by Morrie that we're actually an emerging mid-sized biotech company. We're actually 5 years old. We originated in London and we're NASDAQ listed. We are actually independent, and we actually focus on reprogramming T cells, autologous T cells, with multiple different properties. So what we can do in a single vector is we can actually deliver more than one protein element, which will actually change properties. So they address both the targeting, they also address the microenvironment, and also do have an element of pharmacological control, which we can fit to T cells as well. One of the interesting things about Autolus is if you talked to me a year ago, we were 150 people. The year before that, we were 75 people. So we're approximately doubling in size every year. We have 5 programs in clinic, and we'll be adding a similar number next year.
Great. And so last but not least, we have Rosario Vivaldi, who's the president and CEO of Sigilon Therapeutics. So Rosario, if you could introduce yourself and your company.
Thank you, Morrie. Good morning, everyone. Buenos dias. It's a pleasure to be here. I was reflecting some of what you were saying. So here I am, 1991. I have a patient with Gaucher disease, and he is dying. So what do you do as a doctor? What do you say to the family? What do you do? Oh, there is a new therapy that has been just approved by the FDA. How this drug can get into the country, into Rio, into Brazil. How this family can understand the impact of that new therapy. Well, here we are, 2019. This patient now has 40 plus years old, 2 girls, more than 1,000 patients being treated in Brazil for Gaucher, second largest market in the world, all paid, 100% paid by the government. Yes, you can. Means that you have to work on impactful things, on things that will really change the natural history of diseases, will change the lives of patients. And then everything else you can do after that. At Sigilon, I am very proud to be their CEO. We are trying to pioneer a new class of therapeutic drugs based on shielded living therapeutics to treat patients with serious chronic diseases. I think that we cannot be just focused on monogenic diseases. We cannot do that. You can do much more for many more diseases. Diseases that people may think, like hemophilia, oh, they don't bleed. Well, they don't bleed, but 20 years later, their joint is destroyed despite of factor. Or diabetes, they are well covered. Well, yes, but you require a minute-to-minute regulation, a no peace of mind. And regarding I can tell you I have type 1 diabetes for 45 years. I have to come here with the pump, with the sensor, and yes, I can perform. But what can we do as an industry to change that? And how can we work with payers to really, for them to understand that we are changing the paradigm? People may live longer, may live healthier, and this will impact the system. So I will be very happy to be here to discuss some of these points.
So great. Rogerio, why don't we just stay with you for a second and talk a little bit about a couple of things that you've mentioned. So your company obviously is working to develop novel therapeutics, delivery systems, focusing on diseases like type 1 diabetes. So what gives you optimism that we are going to be making real progress clinically to validate these types of technologies over the next 2 or 3 years, and that we'll see this in other chronic indications as well?
First, I am an optimist. Some of my friends say that I may be crazy, but you need to be crazy when you really want something very badly. And I am, again, we have a partnership with Lilly. Lilly chose Sigilon to really discover the functional cure for people with diabetes. I think that the cell therapy, we know, sometimes we are trying to just replicate what the cell does. So we took a different approach. We just create the cell for the cell to do what the cell is designed to do. And we create the environment, not only the capsule, not only the membrane, but the matrix, the capsule, in order the cell can live long, happy, and healthier. For that, is this a one time, as Matthew said? We don't know if it's one time. The good thing is that if it is not a one time, could be second time, could be third time, different from gene therapy. And so we think that there are nuances that make one different than the others. As in common, we have that constant delivery of protein. And of course, in case of diabetes, we have the smart cell. So we have a circuit of sensing and responding. This works with diabetes. This may work with autoimmune disease in which you have flares of the disease, and that moment you need to have maybe an IL-2. You can't have too much, you can't have, and you control that, because once you control the number of cells that go into the capsule, you control the productivity, the really controllability that we have gives us much more empowerment to, okay, what we can do and what we can expect. So that I will stop in that. But the one thing that it's, and Matthew, the one suggestion, even for ARM, we need to bring the patient advocacy and the patient groups and the patient communities closer, earlier, sooner, because we need to understand some of their problems from their perspective as well. We may be very close to bring many new therapies and advanced therapies to the market. Are the patients prepared for that? Are they prepared to change what they do every day by thinking different things? Sometimes we overestimate that everybody's ready, and it's better to check if they are ready, because they may not be ready, and that would have a very important impact in how we gain access. The other thing, Latin America has 500 million people, the same size of Europe. Don't underestimate that, because they have same genetic predisposition of diseases, and you can have a much larger universe for you to work with and to have as an opportunity.
Thanks. So, John, I was just wondering if you wanted to comment on that too. Just, I mean, again, thinking about indications beyond some of the monogenic disorders. I mean, you all are thinking, I mean, you're moving into NASH and other indications. So are you optimistic about where we are? I mean, where do you think we'll be in the next 3 to 5 years as we look at these diseases?
Sure. I'm super optimistic. Otherwise, I won't be an entrepreneur. So I embrace risk. I love risk. But I think we are, smart people in this company, and there's always counterpower to this optimistic CEO or to the founder. But as Rogerio was saying, patient advocacy is very important. We're now pushing on that. We need to understand what these patient wants, especially on the NASH paradigm. This is so complex, so fragmented. So we are now investing on that aspect. But just to come back a step back, we started on genetic disorders with urea cycle disorders, Crigler-Najjar. But indeed, that was complex because recruiting patients was not easy. Setting up the clinical trials. I think this gentleman here in the room made pioneering work, but it was so hard. I mean, he was just stacking difficulties, risks. And when I joined the company, we said, let's sit, around the table with the board and the investors, and let's, face reality. What is our cell doing? And as Rogerio said, the biology of your cell, of your technology is very important. We are using liver-derived mesenchymal stem cells. These cells has the capacity, first of all, to be potent cells in terms of paracrine effect, in terms of immune modulation. So we decided to go into decompensated cirrhosis and the acute and chronic liver failure, which is a life-threatening disease. And in that case, things became a bit more simple. I'm not saying it's easy, a bit more simple. So we developed, a friendly administration. So the delivery of cell therapies or gene therapies is very important, because you need to understand that cell and gene therapy is not a classical pharmaceutical development. Cell and gene therapy is not a classical model. You don't need huge sales force. You don't need marketing, advertising. You're driven by data, so the risks are really at the end, where we are talking about drug delivery, we are talking about supply chain, cold chain, manufacturing. So we recognized early on that these were critical components. And this company invested a huge amount of monies on manufacturing. We are, have state-of-the-art manufacturing capabilities in Belgium, in the United States. We're investing in supply chain. And I think, the data capture from supply chain, from the patients, from the sites. We talked about infrastructure of healthcare. I think those are very important elements. These are pieces that are not visible to small startups or mid-tier companies, but these are important components. So we're investing massively in those components on top of the clinical data in large markets. And we believe that in certain regions we can really go alone. And that's a bit provocative, given the trends in M&A. But we're going to do it. And that's why we're raising a lot of money from Asia. We believe Asia is a hub for cell therapies. Japan, Korea, and also China. China is more complex, but we're now present in Japan. We have a team there on the ground. We have a partner in Korea, and these guys are just pushing. And the Walloon region support for Promethera and the Belgian infrastructure for cell therapy is top premium. I mean, all these investors are recognizing this. They're investing in Belgian companies. The headquarters in Belgium, and we're basically just growing up globally, US and Asia. So I think that's an important message.
May I just jump in on the patient topic really quickly? So because we spend a lot of time with patients, not just because of my orientation, but because obviously patients want to be cured of whatever ailment, whether chronic disease, whether it's whatever it is, whether it's rare or it's more common. But what patients also really want to know is that they can feel full confidence in production and delivery of these therapies. This industry has done a remarkable job for being in such an emergent phase still of really making this a human interest story, right? Because we have late-stage disease being cured, right? That is global news. So there is a level of understanding, especially in an information technology era, where you can find out at least an adequate layer of information about these therapies and their basic mechanisms, right? It's really now what we see from all of our interviews of patients, either pre, during, or post-infusion therapies, is they want to feel confident that not just their therapy, if it's a batch of one, is being created and stewarded because there's a custodian of their therapy, but they also want to understand what their care pathway demands are, both for themselves and for any of their caretakers or providers for that matter. All right, so there is this awareness among patients who are really at the tip of the spear of this marketplace that we are in a new era where there are dependencies that are really unprecedented. And so naturally, especially where unfortunately there have been missteps in gene therapies over several decades, right, in the genesis of this market and this industry we're creating here, they really need to feel from the folks in this room and the entire value chain that there's ultimate confidence, that the mechanisms are there. That is, in some ways, I mean, I think there's a level of understanding there, and that will only be deepened, but really that this industry, as it grows, is going to be able to have the fidelity to serve each patient and their needs, both on the production and delivery side. And that's what we continuously hear in this market.
I think that's right. And I don't know, Sven, if you want to comment on that. I know from your role at GSK and some of the indications that you all were working on in the relationship with the patient community was critical. So
yes, I can't emphasize, and my colleagues have already emphasized how strongly and how important our contact and collaboration with patients and patient groups are. And I stress the word collaboration because it needs to be a collaboration. What we've seen in the past also is companies using patient groups for their own ends, and we need to be really, really careful about that. It needs to be a two-way street. We need to benefit, but the patients need to benefit also. The only word of caution that I would give companies and groups thinking about it is approach dealing with patients really carefully, because that line is very, very fine, and it's very easily with the best of intentions to overstep that line, to provide data on trials that's not public, that's not been validated yet, just in a side conversation, and it spreads like wildfire, and if things don't work out, you will end up with an incredible firestorm. Always be aware, these patients and the patients' groups know the diseases far better than we will ever know them. They live with them day in and day out, and they are desperate for therapies. As Rogerio was talking about, there are so many, over 7,000 of these rare disorders. And so be really careful how you deal with them. And I think as an organization and as a group, ARM will be able to help guide people in dealing with them appropriately. Look at some of the rare disease companies, how they deal with patients and patients appropriately. Big Pharma doesn't do the job very well. and they tend to be scared of patients and scared of engaging with patients, and we mustn't do that, but we need to do it in a very appropriate and beneficial way so that everyone benefits from it. So I would just use that word of caution, but please engage with them.
So Chris, in the oncology sector, I just wonder if you want to pick up on that theme too, in your experience with Autolus. I mean, given some of the indications you guys are focused on, I mean, whether it's the hematological malignancies and then moving into solid tumor, I mean, have you built strong relationships with the patient community?
Yeah, I think two things. I think, one of the things that's clear is you have to know what your company is good at. And this is a field where you also collaborate with others who can add additional value. And so we do obviously collaborate, for example, with Amy's company. I think early on in the day of Autolus, though, I think a couple of very important decisions were made. The first was that we would be self-reliant for manufacturing because it didn't exist. And I couldn't agree more. There's no point in being excellent at cell programming if you can't deliver your product. So that was one area that we focused on. But the second area may not be quite so obvious. We also focused on a desire to actually manage our own clinical studies and actually have direct contact, therefore, with the centers. And so, for example, one of the things we're engaged in at the moment is a collaboration with a group of parties that are actually helping to establish the delivery process for cell therapy in the UK. We're working, for example, with the Northern Alliance, which is based out of Newcastle University, with Manchester Universities, etc. So I think it's absolutely essential if you go into a new business, a disruptive business, that you actually take the time and the trouble to interface with all of the key stakeholders. So, for example, we have regular contact, I think, with something like 15 patient organizations. We have our own patient advisory board, and we're still a relatively young company. I think the learnings from such things are really invaluable.
Great. One of the other topics we wanted to pick up on, and we've kind of wandered into this a little bit already, but is, Chris, you talked about what you needed to do to invest early on in building the infrastructure to support your programs. So I'm wondering if we could just talk about that a little bit more, because again, as we think forward 3 to 5 years, I think we all understand and believe that large pharma, the large cap biotechs are going to continue to play a critical role in this sector through partnerships, and we're seeing this. But what is the mix going to look like in 3 to 5 years? Will we have companies like Audentes here? I mean, we fully believe Audentes is going to remain a strong mid-tier, emerging large-tier company. Emerging mid-tier, that's what I told Chris. But I think this is an important topic for us because obviously there has been a lot of M&A activity in the sector, and we need strong companies, we need leadership, and what is that going to look like? And are there going to be companies that can do everything? Can they manufacture? Can they address all the issues of supply chain? So I'd love Amy to comment on this a little bit because you're seeing some of these. And maybe if we could take that down the panel.
Sure. Our company has had the great good fortune of working with Kite, so pre and post their acquisition with Gilead. So it's been very interesting and fascinating to have a front row seat on that. I think what they've managed to do really extremely well is to keep the Kite apparatus, the whole organization fully standalone. So they really acknowledged up front, Kite is its own entity, it has its own know-how, it has its own technology, and really not to bleed those in any direction towards the broader Gilead organization.
Do you think that will happen with some of the other?
So we're seeing some evidence that, again, everyone's watching Kite because they happen to be the prime mover in the space. Is it without bumps? Of course, there's always bumps in the road, learnings and opportunities here, right? So, but I think the fundamental structure of keeping the standalone so that there's no defocusing around the R&D, and that pipeline has only grown. So Kite, again, has taken the leverage from a much bigger pharma company and really applied capital. You've seen some of these acquisitions. There are others in the works, we know. So I think, that portfolio building, really, there are only a few mechanisms out there, existing mechanisms. We can talk about how we might get creative to really create a critical mass of capital to invest in a emerging mid-stage biotech company and keep it really sacrosanct and individual. I think there's that opportunity for this space because, of course, maybe I'm naively optimistic, but I'm so bullish about the future. And we're still so early in the genesis of the true marketplace. I think for really innovative investors, there's a really interesting way to consolidate some of the R&D and then really share best practices. Also use economies of scale on what that category of sort of production, delivery, enabling technology. Of course, this is where Vineti plays one piece of the puzzle or provides one piece of the puzzle, but only one. There's a whole value chain that has to be grown up to really support this industry. But I think, again, there are ways to leverage that infrastructure that is being grown up now so all players can benefit. That requires standardization. It requires really heavy time and energy from this industry now to avoid some of the mistakes in the past and establishing other new therapies and new classes of therapies. So I think there's a lot of room and reason to be optimistic. I think we've already seen enormous capital. It's now really getting smart with that capital, and how do you spread it appropriately so you're really maximizing discovery, and then, of course, the complexity around delivery.
So Chris, just back to you. I mean, as you all are raising capital and building, not just for acquisition, but to build a company with a strong pipeline that can deliver product to patients and then commercialize, as you're putting these pieces in place, what are the key components of this that you feel will give you some sense of confidence that you're going to be able to ultimately deliver and meet that commercial demand?
Yeah. In a previous discussion, you asked me, do you think you can do it? And I think, if you look at every generation, there are Genetechs, there are Kites. Whether you stay independent or not has got less to do with whether it's capable and actually more to do with the practical element of what's the value proposition for the shareholders. But if you look at cell and gene therapy in particular, my background was 25 years in Roche before I joined Autolus. Some of the things in cell and gene therapy actually lend themselves to being able to do it yourself. I think the manufacturing base, for example, we're building facilities for 5,000 patients, treatments a year. The cost of a facility like that for a cell and gene therapy product is around 20% of what the comparable cost would be for an antibody factory, and it's also not customized specifically for one product. I think the fact that many of us are actually, at least initially, launching into relapse refractory indications, where you may have 200 to 300 centers that you're predominantly focusing on globally, again, lends itself to being able to do all of those things yourself. I think, what will determine whether companies stay independent has less to do with whether it's feasible and more actually to do with what's the best way to actually generate additional value. It could be, for example, that you can work with a larger company to actually unlock revenue earlier or achieve a higher peak. But I don't think it will be driven necessarily by expertise and scaling, because I think you can actually do those in a small company.
Rogerio, I know you have a perspective on this.
Yeah, and of course, I was involved in several M&A in the past 6 years. I was at Genzyme as the head of a rare disease business unit when we were acquired by Sanofi. Then I went to Spark. I was the first board member and then the head of operations. And then I went to Biosciences, and we were acquired again by Sanofi last year. When people ask, at Biosciences, I had a really incredible 2 years there. We, as a C-level group, we never talked about an acquisition. We never discussed how we should do in order to increase the value of this or that. No, we always talked about how can we do a job better? How can we be faster? Again, and speed here is an important element. I always say patients can't wait, and they can't wait. Then that is a reality. Or we'll get them in a moment where then our therapies will not be as important as they should be. But then, of course, the big pharmas they have, or the big ones, whatever, I think that we should not even call them more big pharma. They are just big and giant. But they have much more access to capital, and that is a reality. And the other thing is that they are much slower than us. That's the reality. If we talk about being fast, so talk about being paralyzed. And they, in some of these companies, although they are spending billions of dollars per year in their R&D budget, they don't move anything. And yes, we move.
Somebody from large pharma on this panel.
Yeah, and yes, we move. Yes, we move. Yes, we move. And we progress. And that's the thing. And I think that some of the recent acquisitions, the companies are doing a good job to protect their entities that they're buying for letting them to progress and to really continue to be fast. Don't put there every bureaucracy that exists in the big mothership. But so that will not be a good
John,
moment.
Before I get to you, but can you talk about that in the context of your partnership with Eli Lilly? I mean, just how you've structured that so you can avoid some of those pitfalls.
Sure. So as
I mean, this is for Rogerio.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So again, first, Lilly and Sigilon, we believe that we can. Yeah. We can cure type 1 diabetes. And that is the first thing for a partnership to succeed. We share the vision for that. Second, Lilly recognized that we are faster than them. So they ask us to do the job, to execute, to be fast. And of course, we work in a very, very, very good partnership. We share with them everything that we are finding. And so I think that when you have transparency and when people understand who does what, this could really go well. The numbers will play well somehow in this thing. But for example, we create a dedicated team to only work with the islet cells, and the other works with our first program. And Lilly loves that our first program is not diabetes, it's hemophilia. So because then they know that they will be leveraging the knowledge that we'll find by innovating and bringing a new technology, a new class, whatever. So again, sharing the same vision, really being transparent, working and talking. Don't escalate things, just talk. What is the problem today? Don't wait 15 days to have a higher problem. We are very happy with that partnership.
Good. John, I'm sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Morrie. So indeed, as Chris and Rogerio was saying, so first Chris said that very important thing, you can do it by yourself. That's very important. Second, Rogerio was saying, we don't wake up at C-level and just talk about M&A. We just build capabilities. We put speed into our execution. And this is what we're doing at Promethera. So we're basically, very value chain oriented, and we are building the pieces. But we have, tremendous need of capital. We're burning a lot of money every year. And the access to capital on our side was tailored to be smart with Asian players. So we went to basically strategic investors that have automation capabilities, close-end manufacturing capabilities, last-mile supply chain, cold chain capabilities. We just talked to these guys and said, come and work with us. Just invest and let's do it together. So we're not self-sufficient as a small 100-people company, but with these big guys that are invested in our company, we're just leveraging the capabilities and introducing speed. And that's what I was saying. We can do it by ourselves, and we will do it. It's as simple as that. So pharma, as Rogerio was saying, they're moving slowly. They have billions. We have, probably much less money, but we're amplifying this through the shareholders and their capabilities, and that's what we're doing right now, both on manufacturing, on the end supply chain. As Amy said, that's very important, the delivery to the patients. So what we're lacking right now is more digitalized supply chain and so on, but I spotted some people here in the room, and that's the next discussions we will have to really beef up our capabilities.
Sven, did you want to add anything there?
So I'd like to maybe just build on what John has said and looking forward to the future. I think he's talking about creating these partnerships, and this is something that we as a group do very well, is creating partnerships. And these partnerships are very variable, large companies, small company to small companies, mid-tier companies. And as we go forward, I think the benefit, and I'm not defending Big Pharma, but I think Big Pharma has a really important role to play. You know, they bring some skills and some strengths that we as smaller companies don't necessarily have, and one of those is the geographical reach. You know, we're all now working and fighting for the first world countries. These are our markets. That's all we think about is the US, the various European countries, perhaps even the big five. And then, you know, perhaps Japan and maybe one or two other countries. But no one's thinking about the patients that really deserve and need a lot of these therapies, like sub-Saharan Africa, the really underdeveloped parts of the Far East. And how do we get these therapies to patients? And you know, Big Pharma has that reach and that capability. So really where I see some of the strengths of the smaller companies is creating those partnerships. And as we go forward, having partners in those different areas that we can get our therapies out to the patients that really, really need them and will really incredibly benefit from them. And as we get further on and we start having these products approved, you know, not every company here is going to have the wherewithal, the capacity, the size, the strength to have sales, marketing, distribution, regulatory, market access in all of these countries. And so perhaps we might see groups getting together and companies, 4 or 5 companies getting together.
So maybe we just talk about that a little bit, because I think that is one of the things that's different about this sector. So I think we all probably, and those of us who've been around a little while, remember some of the older deals of 20 and 30 years ago, which were really defined by Europe, US, ROW. And it's a little bit different now. I mean, as John was alluding to, and Rogerio, I mean, now we can think about different markets, emerging markets, and the requirements for success in that market, those markets may be different. And as Amy said, I mean, maybe these are non-traditional relationships or partnerships with different types of entities. So, you know, I mean, that could take on a number of different forms, and they may not be your standard, you know, biotech pharma relationship. They may be with other types of groups or hospitals. And, you know, is that something we're going to see over the next, again, 3 to 5 years, the foreseeable future? Will we see some of these new groups jump in as part of that? I think John has, you want to start on that?
Yeah, just to give a concrete example, we attracted a huge Japanese conglomerate called Itochu. And these guys, together with Mitsui, our investors, are now controlling, you know, large hospital chains in Asia. So these investors are interested also to get, you know, our products or our lead product going through those channels. So this is a non-traditional way of accessing those markets. I agree with Sven. It's very important that at some point pharma will open up, you know, the rest of the world outside the classical markets that we're talking about. But these kind of sophisticated investors that are not financial investors, they're, you know, trading houses in Japan, and there are some Japanese colleagues here that could probably comment on that, have massive capabilities. You know, they have tens of billions of dollars invested in a hospital chain, in a supply chain, and so on, and they're just going to fuel our products through their channels. And this is a non-traditional approach. And cell and gene therapy is very amenable to those systems. So it's basically a disruption in the field. And that's why I believe, and my team in our C-level believes together with the board, that this company could do it alone on some areas by just partnering with such investors or, you know, having these access, privileged access.
Morrie, I just want to make a comment on Sven, because of course I have been traveling all over the world. I think that what happened in Japan in November 2014 with the new regulation for regenerative medicine will be a mark, and many countries will repeat that. They are coming to really be important. So you as a company, even a smaller company, you can imagine to be putting, having, and collecting revenues from your advanced therapy in Japan before any other country. This opens a huge opportunity for everybody to think different. Again, I have been known, and I know that I'm seeing some colleagues here from old times, that if I don't react when I'm hearing ROW, please, let's kill, okay? There is no ROW in 2019, 2020.
Right.
Rest of the world is bigger than the center of the world. And by definition, if the rest is bigger, means the rest is not the rest, but the core is the rest. So it's just a mathematical consideration. And what we have is different markets. Yes, big pharma, they are everywhere. But we are bringing advanced therapies that not everybody knows, understand, and knows how to talk with the regulatory agents to how can you bring this there. You don't need to have a sales organization, sales and market organization in every single country to be selling your products. But you need one champion to be talking with a very high-level person in a particular country to understand, do you understand what we are trying to do? Do we understand the benefits that by doing this, you will have over multiple years, and not only through your 3 years of your mandate, because again, in some of these countries, you are talking with a politician that was elected, and he only thinks on one thing, how to be reelected. And he is not thinking on something that may bring to someone else the return. So I just wanted to, again, today, rare disease became fashion popular, although still rare. I was the first one in the industry to call a business unit rare disease, and now it's really wonderful to see everybody talking about rare disease. But we don't need 100 people in the field to promote that. We need dozens of really key people that understand how to do.
Fully agree.
And that is a very different. Do I think that the farmers will understand that? Yes, they will. And yes, they have lots of good examples. Maybe Novartis Avexis is a good example that they are really expanding and doing more. I want to see more and more. But there is a difference on how you shape the environment to get the new and advanced therapies. I think that we still have some challenge, as Matthew said at the beginning of the day. We still have significant challenge for us to overcome. And the products may be ready before we overcome those challenges. And that may be an interesting situation. How are we going to do with this?
It's true.
Amy?
Yeah, no, I would just say, so I love the optimism. Just to maybe play devil's advocate, the whole reason we are in this business is to extend access to patients, not just in the primary markets. But I think unfortunately or fortunately, the paradigm shift that this new market is causing is a GMP redefinition, right? What is GMP is being redefined. And so that does, as you were saying, John, put pressure on other value chain partners to behave differently and to really think about the purpose-built approach here to hastening in an industry. And so I wish I had confidence, whether you're big pharma or mid-stage, in a prioritization around outside of APAC, US, EU marketplaces, but the investment that's required to really, again, invigorate a value chain so that you can produce at scale is so difficult. And we haven't worked it out, never mind how we're going to get reimbursed for these therapies in any single market yet. We haven't worked any of those challenges out to their end. So I wish I could be optimistic about a 3 to 5 year time frame. I'm thinking it's more like 10 to 15 years. I'd love to be proven wrong. But I just don't see, how we work through these very localized, intimate challenges in a quicker time frame than that. I wish I could be. I hope I'm wrong.
So a number of people quote, the statistics about the pipeline that we have. I mean, kind of across the board in cell and gene therapy, including, the head of our own regulatory agencies talking about 20 or 30 products coming through in the next 3 to 5 years. So, Amy, in light of that, are we at a point where we can handle 20? And leaving aside just, the reimbursement issues, because we've talked about those, and those will be discussed maybe additionally a little bit later today. But in terms of logistics, infrastructure, can we support 20 to 30 of these products in the market?
We better be ready. I think that's the remit. So we all have to work collectively. This is a moment.
So you are optimistic?
I'm optimistic about being ready because I don't think there's an option, but I don't think we're going to be ready globally. I just don't think we are. And I think that, key centers of excellence are losing money on every transaction, every infusion. At UCSF in our backyard, we know that the president of the hospital physically meets with a cadre of colleagues on every single patient case before they receive a CAR T therapy. It's just not scalable because they're losing, the $125,000, $150,000 per patient, right? So I think there's no choice, but we have to figure it out in some beta capacity and then extend a localized version to other markets. But we haven't even done it for the US yet. So I think this is my opportunity to challenge everybody to say we have a window here to work together to really industrialize. There's a category of work we can do together to industrialize process. We obviously have lots of work to do on reimbursement. None of this is simple. But we are in that window right now. And then we can take the learnings and apply them in other markets, which is absolutely an imperative on its own.
So one of those areas where we can work together, and I hope we're working together, is around standards and standardization. I know Sven's looking at me because I told about TML for this as a member of the standards coordinating body. Yeah. But we've been talking about this since we began ARM. Start 10 years ago, the need for standards. This is not something you do overnight. It takes a while to develop these. This is done through consensus, through process, and you have to invest in it. And one of the concerns I have is, are we adequately investing in the development of standards? Are we leaving this to smaller companies and standards development organizations that are not adequately resourced to do it? So I don't know if you want to share your perspective on that.
Yeah, thank you, Morrie. So just if I could take a moment for a shameless plug for the standards coordinating body. Those of you that aren't involved or don't know about it, please speak to me or have a look on the website. I think this is a critical group of volunteer organizations getting together and thinking about the standards that we need. We've heard from all of the panelists that this is a rapidly emerging new area. We are developing new processes, new mechanisms of doing things on a daily basis. And we are all tending to go in pretty diverse directions. And that's wonderful now in the interesting, exciting times where we're treating patients of 1s and 2s, or even 5s and 10s. But very soon, I hope, we are going to be treating thousands, hundreds of thousands, and millions of patients. And this one-off patient having consultation about every single patient that receives an advanced therapy is not sustainable. And so in order for us to industrialize and turn these into therapies that reach millions of patients around the world, we're going to have some standards, some standard ways of doing things. And if we don't define these ourselves, they will be defined for us. And we've seen this happen in other areas previously. And so this is really a call to think about what are the critical standards? How can we think about getting things together? And it's everything from autologous products with the apheresis. How can we standardize? Maybe not necessarily the apheresis machine that's used, but perhaps the material that comes out of the apheresis machine. How do we standardize that? How do we standardize certain of the tests, the cell counting, the sterility, things like that? How do we standardize the way we do labeling for tracking? How do we standardize registries? There was a lot of discussion about registries. How do we standardize even the infrastructure for the registry? Matt mentioned this morning about how do we think about outcomes for long-term outcomes, be they safety and efficacy outcomes, or be they payer outcomes that might be required. How do we standardize things like that so that when you bring your therapy to market, you've got a choice of a few things and you can slot in with that. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And I think this will be critically important. And we've taken some steps forward, and the FDA has been very forward-looking, and they have actually provided the standards coordinating body with some money to start looking at what the standards landscape is, where we've got standards already, where the shortcomings are, and then to be able to go forward to get the standards creation bodies to start putting together standards. But one of the big challenges that we have is companies that are really innovating, that are coming up with potentially exciting tests, are still thinking that these are potentially value added to that company, and we need to find a way to get around that so that if you've got a really cool test that's a groundbreaker or changes the paradigm, think about sharing it with the the wider organization, with the wider group, so that everyone can benefit from it. Thanks, Morrie.
That was good. That was a good plug, Sven. And we had to give you the pulpit to preach the gospel of standards at the next meeting. But it's a critically important issue, and I know. I mean, Chris, I'm just wondering from where you all said, kind of thinking about, all of the components, of your supply chain and your vector supply, and then, as you begin to kind of move towards commercialization, are there best practices, standards that you're thinking about or developing yourselves?
So I think, firstly, invention, need is the mother of invention. We're in a situation where I think we all recognize that things are evolving very fast. Right. And so I think there will naturally be some convergence, because at the end of the day, we all serve the patient, and the patients are actually going to centers who are delivering treatment, and those centers will demand of us a degree of standardization. I think another thing that we've actually seen is that we've seen not just the products evolve, but all of the services, all of the support, the manufacturing technology. I think we're in an age where we'll have rapid developments, not just with the products, but everything around the products. So as we move forward, our business is based upon the technology that we put into viral vectors, so we will always have an element of control, but that's not to say that we won't be increasingly collaborating. So I think it's public knowledge, but we collaborate with Miltenyi on machines, AB on, and I think that will be a trend. I think companies will double down on what they do that's different, and they will be looking for ways to reduce the barriers and hurdles around things which are, if you like, not their area of core competence or are actually common to multiple companies.
Okay. Any other comments on that? We only have a few minutes left. I think we have microphones in the room too, so if there are any questions in the audience, I wanted to have an opportunity. So we have a microphone here if anybody would like to ask a question. There's a question here.
Habib Torfi with Invitrex. A quick question for either John or Rogerio. As a sort of a emerging market, emerging company, being a US-based or a European-based company, what would be your approach to penetrating some of these markets? Is there a formulation? You have a plan where basically you take your technology to some of these developing countries?
Rogerio, you want to?
So I think that when we talk about rare disease or particular diseases, there is always the referral center. There is always that center that people understand the disease, they understand the patients, they understand everything. I always start with that. And if they are in a particular country, so we start from there. Then we start with, okay, what is the regulatory framework in that particular country? And again, many of the countries outside of the US, they have a more socialized medicine. Again, we still, you saw the map, and you have Canada there, and yes, they are, you notice that they only have one of these nearly advanced therapies now in that bucket. But if we don't say that for hemophilia, the doctors, they don't have the freedom to choose which product they want. It is what product the government decided to have. And I think this is wrong. So basically, you start from the referral center, the centers of excellence, that is the name, and then understanding the regulatory framework, you can really try to influence to how the change will have. And then someone said yesterday, it is all about value. But you have to understand, for example, if you have a drug that will now make patients in dialysis to live longer, you will never have a benefit because the cost, someone is dying, now someone is not dying. So this starts at the beginning against you, and you have to explain that you are bringing value. There is a value, there's a value for life. And I think that also you have to be very transparent. What's your supply chain that you're trying to you're not really abusing of the system, because And then finally, I think that the pay for performance will stay. We'll have to figure a way, because some of these places, or even in the US, they may not believe when I say that this will work for the next 5 years. Okay, I want to see that. And while I see that, I pay you. If I don't see that, I don't pay you. And that's it's a healthcare mortgage, whatever you call. But I think that I will start with the center of excellence in any particular country, and then you understand what you can do. Shaping the environment will be the second simple advice.
Just to add a few words, because you also asked, John or Rogerio, we indeed in Japan, there's a tremendous, lack of access to organs for transplantation because of the cultural and the religious and the way it is in Japan. So we went early on to PMDA. We talked with them, and we talked to the KOLs. And our product is an alternative for liver transplantation in those decompensated cirrhosis. So for them, it's a huge need. And that's how we went into it. And as Rogerio said, go to the centers of excellence, go to the regulators, talk to the KOLs, and then the investors will come. And then the people will put the infrastructure around to make it possible. So that's the way we've done it in 2017.
So I think, so we are actually out of time, so I think we're going to probably have to leave it there. I wanted to get a parting word from everybody, but because we have a panel coming up right after this, I think we're going to have to call it quits. But please, if you could join me in thanking the panel for great discussion.